critics say it's not reform, it's regime change, effectively, is what you're trying to push through. They say that what this bill will do, it'll arm you, the Prime Minister, with the power to appoint judges that you want, and for your government to overturn any judgment of the Supreme Court that you don't like, as long as there's even a one-vote majority in the Knesset. In other words, the judiciary, they say, will be neutered, and with that, the rule of law, and with that, democracy itself.
Yeah, well, let's take that apart one by one. The first thing that has to be understood is what is a democracy? Democracy is majority rule with the protection of individual rights. And to get these two things, what you have is the checks and balances between the three branches of government, the legislative, the executive, and the judicial. Everybody understands that. In Israel, over the last 20 years, that balance has been taken off the rails because the judiciary became not independent. It's always been independent, will always be independent. It became all-powerful. So it can nullify any decision of the parliament, the Knesset, and it can be a legal decision, a legal law, that's fine, but they say it's not reasonable. It doesn't exist anywhere in the democracies, such powers. It can nullify any decision of the government, and often has. It can nullify any appointment of the government. It can intervene in military matters. It can intervene in our battle against terrorists. It can intervene in taking gas out of the sea that costs us billions of dollars. I finally got it out. All these things are unacceptable.
I wonder if I wonder if this is the actual rationale for this grassroots protest, or if it's grassroots at all. I recall that Netanyahu and Trump were friends and allies. They worked together not only on economic matters, but on military matters and on peace matters. It was Netanyahu and Trump who signed the historic Abraham Accords, putting an end, bearing the hatchet between Israel and Muslim states, including the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Morocco, Sudan, and other places, with a promising start to normalizing relations with Saudi Arabia as well. I know also that the left have always hated Netanyahu, and George Soros himself personally invested in the campaign that finally dethroned Netanyahu 2 elections ago. Well, Netanyahu is back, restored, so to speak, and it must make these Trump derangement types furious. Imagine if Trump were to be reelected in America in 2024. That is how the left has reacted to Netanyahu winning recently. And I can't help but wonder if these people on the streets are some sort of color revolution, attempt to depose Netanyahu just because some people don't like him and couldn't beat him at the ballot box. Well, let's talk to someone who actually knows what's going on, our friend Joel Pollak, senior editor-at-large at Breitbart.com, who has written about the subject in his latest post on Locals.com. Joel, great to see you again. My theory, as you just heard, is that Netanyahu is as hated in Israel by the left as Trump is as hated in America, and that these are exaggerated claims of dictatorship. Many of these reforms would be normal to Canada and the United States, and this whole thing is trumped up. Am I wrong? Am I simplifying things too much? Why don't you help explain?
The hatred of Netanyahu is a little bit different. In Israel, people will acknowledge that Netanyahu is very effective, but the common complaint, not just on the left, but also by some on the right, is that he's just been there too long. He's Israel's longest serving prime minister, and some people are just tired of him. They'd like to see somebody else have a chance. Paradoxically, the left keeps giving Netanyahu reasons to return because they're pursuing these completely frivolous claims of corruption against him, and they've tried everything they possibly can to keep him out of power. So he remains the center of Israeli politics, and because of his language skills, because of his statesmanship, he remains indispensable both to the Israeli right and to Israel as a whole. There are very few political figures in Israel who can span the divide between secular and religious, or secular and nationalist, who can speak to the democracies of the West as well as the other powers of the East and Asia and so forth. I mean, he's just become an indispensable person. And I know there are a lot of Israelis who wish it weren't so, but that's a little bit different from where Trump is. Trump remains an outsider. He's not really part of the political firmament, but he has a movement behind him. And he's the only person in the United States who seems able to articulate the policy preferences of the vast majority of ordinary Americans. Our system currently does not represent those preferences very well. We have a system in Washington that is corrupted, that has its entire separate ecosystem of interest groups and lobbyists and so forth who make sure that government works the way they wanted to, not the way that the American people wanted to. That's in serious need of disruption and reform. Trump disrupted it somewhat, but he was up against a much more daunting challenge than I think even he anticipated when he promised to drain the swamp. People don't like Trump because of his antics, because of his rhetoric, because of the things that some of his supporters do. It's more a question of style with Trump, but he still remains indispensable because of the policies and ideas he brings to American politics. But there are parallels, and the parallel is this. Both in the United States and in Israel, the left simply does not seem to want to accept democratic elections that it loses. And it's not just in the US and Israel, it's also in the UK. When Brexit was passed by a referendum, the Remain camp, the losing camp, insisted for years that the election had to be illegitimate, or that voters didn't really understand the issues, that perhaps the referendum should be held again, or that the complications of leaving the European Union should result in a scaled down Brexit. But there were all these attempts to undermine the decision made by the British electorate. And we see this over and over again, country after country. When the left loses, they decide that the election was somehow wrong or corrupted, or there was Russian collusion or whatever it was. And yet they accuse the right of denying democracy. So they accuse Republicans, or they constantly lecture Republicans about the need to respect democratic elections. I agree people should respect democratic elections. I agree that January 6th was a very terrible event. And yet it's Democrats who constantly try to undermine faith in our democracy. And even before the last midterm elections, Joe Biden was very wishy-washy on whether he thought they would be legitimate or not. One gets the sense that it matters whether his party would have won or not. Democrats have, in common with the left around the world, this tendency to attack democratic outcomes that they don't like. So that's partly what's going on in Israel.
Well, let me ask you about the substance, because in almost none of the criticisms against him do I hear a particularization of what he's doing wrong. I hear this absurd language. He's ending democracy as we know it. He's creating a dictatorship. I heard one former senior government official say, it's no better than Iran. He's making Israel no, I mean, it's just absurd, overheated rhetoric, and yet almost none of them point to a specific thing. I showed that clip from Piers Morgan where Netanyahu says we want to be like other democracies where the elected officials choose the judges. Judges can't veto who goes on. I mean, I really haven't heard of anywhere else in the world where judges get to perpetuate themselves or get to veto a pick by the prime minister. Are there any actual things he's doing that are so execrable?
So I looked into these judicial reforms when they were first proposed back at the beginning of the year. And there are four basic reforms. One restricts the Supreme Court's power to strike down legislation by requiring the full Supreme Court to sit there and strike down the legislation, not just 3 judges who can be chosen by the Chief Justice, because that allows the Chief Justice to pick and choose. It's almost like saying, well, I'm only going to let the conservative justices decide this law because I want the law to be upheld or struck down in a particular way. So one of the reforms takes away the power of the Chief Justice to manipulate the outcome by choosing only the 3 or 4 or whatever panelists that are going to hear a particular issue. They say, no, the whole court has to hear it. Another reform is what you mentioned, that the Knesset will be allowed to select the judges. That is, the elected leaders of Israel would select the judges. That's how we do it in the United States. In fact, many of our judges at the state and local level are elected directly. Another reform would allow government agencies to appoint their own legal advisors rather than relying on the Ministry of Justice to do so. That seems just common sense. And then there's one reform, this is the most controversial, and it's one I actually disagree with, which is allowing the Knesset to override the Supreme Court on a majority vote. So I made clear very early on, I thought that one was a loser, because if you can allow the legislature simply to nullify Supreme Court decisions, you don't really have an independent judiciary. And when I brought that up with Israelis, and I had intelligent conversations with Israelis, they said, well, that's not such an important reform. If we have to give one up, we'll give that one up. There has to be some process of review, but we see your point and we're willing to compromise on that. In fact, in recent weeks, some of the people who were most adamant in advocating for these reforms said that they were willing to give that one up. So many of these reforms are quite common sense. Some of them are more controversial, but there's room for compromise. There's room for discussion. That's not what the Israeli left did. They took to the streets. They protested. They said Netanyahu is trying to become a dictator. They said we're no longer a democracy. They called it a coup. They called it an attempt to cement a regime. They said terrible things about it. You've quoted some of them. And that's really where I stepped in and said, you know what, this is inappropriate. Israel's security depends on the idea that Israel is a democracy. That's why the United States supports Israel. That's why many Americans support Israel. That's why Israel is able to defend itself in Europe. If Israel became a dictatorship, that would be much more difficult. Then it would just be a question of whether it's in America's interest to support Israel, quite apart from whether it's a democracy or not. It'd be a harder case to make, not impossible, but harder.
That was an excerpt from the Ezra Levant show. I'm Ezra Levant. Every weekday, I do a monologue about the topic of the day. Then I interview a fascinating guest, either in studio or via Skype. And then I read your mail, whether it's fan mail or hate mail, which is sometimes even more interesting. This is on our premium service, though, called Rebel News Plus. Go to rebelnewsplus.com. It's $8 a month or less if you buy a whole year in advance. You get my show every weeknight, plus Sheila Gunn Reid's show every week. It's called The Gun Show. It's pretty amazing. You know, we rely on you because we do not take a dime from the government. In Canada, that makes us almost unique. So please help us out and help yourself to some great journalism at rebelnewsplus.com.